Good morning, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So the first thing I would like to do is, we have some new people here. I just kind of want to touch quickly on how we do it here. So we have a short talk followed by a little discussion, and people who are members of the church are invited to give talks. So on anything, you're not required to give a talk, but you're invited to give a talk. So it will be different speakers and different topics every time. And I'd like to share with you the Seattle Atheist Creed so that you can consider if it makes sense to you. So Seattle Atheist Church was built on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to other conscious beings, which are all conscious beings, and we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. The only other thing that I wanted to, there are a couple things. So October 21st, we will have a vision board making workshop. If anybody would like to participate in that, start collecting your images now. And the purpose for that is just it could be goal setting, intention setting, and if you want to have something where you can help yourself visualize, on October 21st, we'll get together at someone's house and do that. Let me know. And then finally, the way that we pay for Seattle Atheist Church is through donations. So seattleatheist.church, there's a donation link, and any donations, including small ones, help to just basically to rent this room. So today we have the room for 1 hour, and our goal is to have the rooms for 2 hours every time. So soon, that's what we're working towards. So Stephen, please come on up.
All right. Hey, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to start with a question. So I have a friend, his name is Mark. His house was completely destroyed by a hurricane. His family lost everything they owned. They don't have any insurance, and now they need to start completely over from scratch again. So here's my question for you. How many of you feel compassion for Mark? Raise your hands. A few people out there. A little bit. You're wavering too. Okay, a couple people are waving their hands a little bit. All right. What if I told you that he built his house in an area that was known for hurricanes? That the real estate agent warned him that the house might be destroyed by a hurricane when he bought the house. He had to sign a little dotted line saying, this isn't a hurricane zone. How many of you still feel compassion for Mark? A lot of you. Okay, you're still doing it. All right, good. What if I told you that this house was the only one that Mark could afford? That he wanted to buy a house in a safer area, but he just didn't have the cash. This was the best house that he could buy his family. Okay, how many? Hands are going back up again. Some people still wavering. Okay. What if I told you that Mark was once a multimillionaire, but he squandered his fortune away through gambling? Mark. We still have some, we have compassion out there. It's great to see that. Okay. But what if I told you that scientists just discovered a gene that people who have this gene had an 85% chance of becoming addicted to gambling? Would you guys still have compassion for Mark? Yes, hands go up again. All right. So today's sermon is about compassion. And I believe the reason that this sermon is important to me is I believe that compassion, along with other emotions such as feelings of fairness, shame, and guilt, compassion is one of the foundations of morality. People do good things because they feel the right emotions in the right situations. Compassion is a slippery word. I am going to use it in the same way that some people use the word sympathy or use the word pity. So there's a lot of variations, and one of the things that you quickly discover as soon as you start discussing emotions are people have very, very different ideas of what different emotions mean. Even within the same community, people talk about jealousy and envy and all these emotions in different ways. But I'm going to be I'm going to be using the word, I'm going to be translating actually when other people use words like sympathy and pity, I'm going to be converting that into compassion. when I'm speaking today. So all of that, and somewhat related to caring as well. I am going to distinguish, though, between compassion and empathy. So empathy is ability to imagine what other people feel without evaluating that feeling. So it's the ability to project yourself into other people's shoes and be able to, experience what they're experiencing. And that's a little different from compassion because there's not necessarily any judgment involved. In fact, you can be empathetic with a bad guy. You can actually feel the emotions a bad guy is feeling and still, wish that something horrible happens to him. And that's perfectly consistent. By compassion, I'm going to use Martha Nussbaum's definition of compassion. She says that compassion is a painful emotion occasioned by the awareness of another person's undeserved misfortune. So that's the definition I'll be working with here. In other words, compassion is when you recognize someone else's bad luck. If someone else has bad luck, then you feel compassion for them. And that's the definition I'll be sticking with over this sermon. Okay, so compassion has its roots in biology. One of the distinctive things about humans are we are completely helpless when we're born, right? I mean, someone has to take care of us. If mothers didn't feel compassion when babies cried, then have a bunch of starving babies very quickly. We're super dependent on the compassion of others just to survive. Some neuroscientists have claimed that there's evidence that both empathy and compassion has a biological basis in something called mirror neurons. You've probably heard of mirror neurons before. The idea of mirror neurons is, I'll use the words V.S. Ramachandran, a neuroscientist at UC San Diego. He describes mirror neurons like this. I'm not going to it's kind of a long description, so I'll just tell you what he says. The basic idea of mirror neurons is when you see someone else doing something, the same neurons fire off in your head. And so there's a mirror between what's going on in their brain and your brain. So it's supposed to be a direct link between that makes the ability for you to empathize with another person and to feel compassion for someone else because you actually are feeling their pain. So if that another person gets pricked in their thumb, and they have the experience of pain, the idea of mirror neurons is you have the exact same experience of pain in your head. And they found this by correlating, what one monkey does, what another monkey does in their neurons. So that's supposed to be a biological basis of compassion. So there are, good reasons to believe that humans are just born with compassion, that we need it to be able to navigate the world and to be able to survive in the world. But there's also no doubt that compassion is molded by society. It's not purely biological. I think it has its roots in biology, but there's a lot of social input in it as well. Candace Clark, who wrote it, she's a sociologist who wrote a book on compassion called Misery and Company, which I'll be pulling a bunch of studies from. She writes, sympathizing with another person's miseries is a morality constructing act. Is a person at fault or a victim? Does he or she deserve affirmation or reprieve or not? Wider discussions of the other's problems pulls additional sympathizers into the play and brings the moral issue to the group's attention. If the media gets involved, the drama is transmitted to the viewing public, then the implicit questions become, who should get our sympathies and why? Answering these questions brings both people and principles into public discussion. Thus, everyday calamities can serve the same function as Greek tragedies. So consider these questions. Should you feel compassion for Edwin Snowden? It's one question. Another question, should you feel compassion for Michael Brown? Now, the reason I'm bringing both of these questions up are, they're dividing lines in our culture. Depending on how you answer that question, if you feel compassion for either of these people, instead of blame or a feeling of injustice or outrage or a number of other possible emotions, depending on how you fall in that dividing line, you're actually deciding which group of people that you identify with. So compassion is something that people work together in a society to try to enforce common rules about when you should feel compassionate for other members of a society. So compassion definitely has a social component as well as just being a natural biological thing. So your group, in a certain sense, trains you, at least they train your unconscious, on what situations deserve compassion and what situations do not. After you've been properly trained by your group, then you will feel the right compassion in the right situation. So you have to be, your decision of your group is important for how you feel about things in the future. It helps decide, it helps you feel the right emotions in the right context. Okay, so let's go back to the definition of compassion that I started with. So remember, according to Martha Nussbaum, the defining characteristic of compassion is 1, something bad has to happen, and 2, and the bad thing must be a matter of luck. So those are the 2 necessary components for you to feel compassion for someone. So let's start with the first part of that definition. The bad luck must be sufficiently bad. Martha Nussbaum has a great example in her book. Hume, a Roman aristocrat, discovers that his shipment of peacock tongues from Africa has been interrupted. Feeling that his dinner party that evening would be a total disaster in consequence, he weeps bitter tears and implores his friend Seneca to pity him. Seneca laughs. That means Seneca. He lost his peacock tongues. His dinner party is ruined. Question is, should you have compassion? Now, actually, from reading Martha Nussbaum, I also get the feeling that she's laughing at poor Q here, because she doesn't take that as a big enough tragedy, the missing peacock tongues, for the guy to actually deserve compassion. And it does seem like kind of a minor thing. So there is a better sense of what counts as sufficiently bad can be gathered from something called the New York Times Neediest Cases Appeal. Have you guys heard of this before? I hadn't actually heard of this before I started looking into it. But the New York Times, since 1912, they have had this column where they list, they stopped actually listing people's names around 1972, but they listed the 100 neediest cases in New York. They would send the reporters out, they would come up with stories of people who really needed compassion, and then they would publish it around Christmas time every year as an appeal for people to donate money or donate services to those neediest cases. So what Candace Clark, the sociologist, did is she actually had her graduate students get together and they coded, the words that they used for all those neediest cases to see, well, what were the things that triggered people to show compassion? And let me give you an example of one of the neediest cases. Let's see, this one's from 1921. Here's the headline: Got meals from ash cans. It described 2 ragged, unwashed sisters, 7 and 5 years old, who fed themselves from garbage cans. Abandoned by their parents, they were passed around among relatives, living in crowded shanties who didn't want them. At first, the relatives put them on the floor at night and let them cry themselves to sleep. Later, they put them along the walls on chairs, which served as beds for more important members of the household. When sound asleep, Doris and Fanny would be lifted out and placed on the floor to make the chair beds available for the real owners. They were undernourished and suffering from severe skin troubles due to the ash can diet. Yet the story concluded, the good stuff in the sisters is indestructible. They are still 2 sweet, good-tempered, bright little girls. So this is a horrible story, right? I mean, this is 2 really young girls who have to live out of garbage cans. It's a horrible story, but it's interesting the things that the New York Times reporter picked out to try to gather compassion for the 2 girls. The words they used, the situation, what they felt was important enough to highlight in the story to actually draw the reader's interest into it and actually get them to donate money. So Candace Clark and her students coded 175 cases, and unsurprisingly, these appeals focused on 3 main things. First, they all used compassion-invoking words, such as, quote, tragic, wretched, shivering, bad words, things like that to get people's compassion. They also focused on bad luck words, such as accidents and illnesses. That was a really important part of these neediest cases. And then finally, as you can see from the last sentence, which I read a moment ago, moral worth words, such as hardworking and Girl Scout, are also very important. You have to feel that they're worthy of compassion. So you have to have all 3 elements for people to donate money into these 100 neediest cases. So originally, back in 1912, poverty was the key plight in the neediest cases. Almost all of them involved, people just not having enough money to live, to find food, to survive. Over time, poverty became less of a factor, mainly because of social changes, right? I mean, now there are social programs to prevent people from at least, that would provide housing and provide the basic necessities of life. By the 1970s, the focus shifted to things like alcoholics and people suffering from addictions and mental illnesses. And those started to make up more of the appeals. People who weren't able to, not so much money, but got into emotional difficulties, and they were making appeals around that. And eventually the neediest cases, they stopped taking money and started to focus more on employment services, mental health services, other ways to help the neediest cases. Okay, so the other half of the definition of compassion is that the bad luck must be outside of your control. If it's something that you could have controlled, then you can't feel compassion for the person. So, as our hurricane story at the beginning of this sermon illustrates, we, depending on how the story is structured, depending on your background beliefs that you're projecting into the story, you might feel compassion or not. And I'm assuming, I'll find out later, that the people who are wavering, like John, wavering on whether or not to give compassion there, were wavering depending on what they believed about the background of the hurricane, of the people who bought the house that was destroyed by the hurricane. Depending on what you're projecting into the story, you may or may not feel compassion. So, for example, we feel compassion for someone who gets lung cancer only when they don't smoke. If they didn't smoke, then we're much more likely to feel compassion for someone who gets lung cancer. We feel compassion for someone who gets laid off from their job only when they were hardworking, right? If they were hardworking. We feel sorry for someone who loses, a foot race only when they feel that they actually tried. They trained, they practiced, they tried to do well. To prepare for the foot race. If they kind of slept in every weekend and didn't put any effort into it, then I don't feel so much compassion that you lost. So in particular, it's really hard to feel compassion for babies born with birth defects, right? I mean, there's no way a baby can control what happens to the baby at birth. It's really a cold-hearted person who can't feel compassion for, something for a blameless baby born with a birth defect. It's just outside of the baby's control. It's also hard not to feel compassion for someone who gets struck by a meteor. Oddly, there is one recorded case of a person being struck by a meteor. It happened in Alabama in late November 1954. Ann Hodges was napping on her couch, covered by quilts, when a softball-sized hunk of black rock broke through the ceiling, bounced off a radio, and hit her in the thigh, leaving a pineapple-shaped bruise. So there was, in fact, one person in recorded history who got hit by a meteorite, Ann Hodges. And it's hard to blame Ann for that. It's hard to prepare for being hit by a meteorite. Joe, you look concerned, but we can discuss later. I think we're safe here, though. Just Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, we'll discuss later. Yeah. All right. So compassion often competes with blame, right? It's hard to feel both compassion and blame for a person at the same time. And usually when we're judging these cases, think of a judge at a court bench, it usually comes down to, do we blame the person or do we feel compassion for the person? Do you blame someone for being overweight, or do you feel compassion for someone who is overweight? It depends on how much control you think the person has over the weight. Do you blame someone for being sent to jail, or do you feel compassion for someone who's sent to jail? Again, it depends on how much control you think the person has over the situation. If the world were perfectly just, then you would never feel compassion. You wouldn't need to. You would only blame people all the time. So if we live in a perfectly just world, it could be completely compassion-free because everyone gets their just desserts in all situations. You want to feel compassion for the homeless because, darn it, they deserve it for being homeless, for not working hard enough. That's the perfectly just world. You want to feel compassion for someone who has a heart attack because that person ate too much fatty food. In some ways, blame is more empowering than compassion. Blame means that you can change your circumstances. You can control things. Blame, remember, is the difference between compassion and blame is the amount of control over it, right? And so someone who's blamed for something could have done otherwise. They could have changed their circumstances to change the outcome. Compassion is the acknowledgement that bad stuff just happens in the world and you have no control over it. So compassion in some ways is equal to weakness and blame is equal to power. If you should want to be blamed for things. You should, try to avoid all compassion for things if you believe in a perfectly just world. All right. So I want to move on and talk about Candace Clark, going back to the sociologist. She discusses something she calls the socio-emotional economy. So by that, what she's talking about is the way that emotions work in general is it works like an exchange. You build up, emotion credits, you spend them, everyone has an account, you can overdraw your account. There's a whole economy that people interact with where they exchange emotions. So she argues that reciprocity is an important part of compassion. If you don't show sufficient compassion for someone who has showed compassion for you in the past, then you can be cut off from your group. She tested this by giving the following scenario to 49 people in New Jersey. Don't know why she did in New Jersey. Presumably she was teaching there. Here's the scenario. Helen gives sympathy to Joan when Joan's car breaks down. Later, Helen has a run-in with her boss at work. Joan does not offer her sympathy. How should Helen feel? Got some finger gestures? Anyone, let me read it again. Helen gives sympathy to Joan when Joan's car breaks down. Later, Helen has a run-in with her boss at work. Joan doesn't offer any sympathy. How should Helen feel? Any response to that? Well, so more than 80% said that Helen was entitled to feel negative emotions such as being hurt, right? Regardless of the justification or anything going on with her run-in with the boss, the point of the story is people feel like, if you've done the work to show compassion for this person, they better do the work to show compassion for you for a situation that may or may not deserve compassion in the future. You have that in your bank account. You should be able to spend that credit and get appropriate level of compassion back. And actually, Candace Clark, she brings up a lot of examples of this in the book, where people get upset with their neighbors because in the past I showed compassion when this happened and she didn't show compassion for me. A lot of cases where compassion really works like exchange, right? And people keep balances and they keep track of how much compassion one person is showing from another. In a certain sense, she's arguing that it's all about reciprocity, right? It's all about getting the appropriate return on your compassion bucks when you invest compassion in other people. Candace Clark also argues that Jesus in the New Testament advocates going beyond pure reciprocity. This is a quote that she uses from Luke. She actually presents it in kind of a weird way. She says that Jesus' disciples are completely confused by Jesus' argument here, but this is the argument that Jesus comes up with. So this is from Luke. Whenever you give a lunch or dinner, do not invite your friends or brothers or relatives or wealthy neighbors. They might invite you in return and thus repay you. No, when you have a reception, invite beggars and the crippled, the lame and the blind. You should be pleased that they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid in the resurrection of the just. Now, up to a certain point, it was like, wow, Jesus is going to say, no reciprocity is involved. You should just do it out of the goodness of your heart. And then it's all ruined with that last sentence, right? There's still payback. You'll still get the payback when you die. So it's hard to, even in the Bible, it's hard to find a pure form of just pure compassion without someone expecting something in return. And this leads us to the next point that she makes. People have a limited amount of compassion. After a certain amount of time, people start cutting their compassion off. That's mainly because compassion requires work. So Candace Clark talks about, she interviewed a bunch of people. This is one of the stories she heard about compassion. She had a lot of stories like this also. This is about a younger brother's appeals for compassion. I used to feel that I should feel sorry for him just because he was my little brother. Also, my mother and father wanted me to help him out. He has several crises a week, sometimes several a day. He is always looking for compassion. He has more sad stories than anyone I know. Now I set time limits. I'll listen to him for 15 minutes and no more. And I set other limits, like I won't listen to him if he calls in the middle of the night. He has to call during reasonable hours. He had a flat tire, I should say another flat tire, at about 4 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Eve. And he called me to come get him and his girlfriend on the turnpike and drive them to the bus station. Before I would have gone, but this time I told him to call AAA and I hung up. Nervous laugh. Anyway, so this is a woman who obviously reached her limit on the amount of compassion she's willing to give anymore because she feels like, you're overdrawn. You're the compassion bank as you've spent all your credits out of the compassion bank. So Here's another example. Christopher Bohm, who's the cultural anthropologist, he writes about hunter-gatherer cultures, and he actually has several examples of hunter-gatherers putting limits on the amount of compassion that they feel for other members of their tribe. He writes, hunter-gatherers set limits as to how much they'll invest in family members who are becoming so infirm that they can no longer walk effectively, as this is a serious problem for nomads who must carry small children and needed paraphernalia with them when they frequently change campsites. Most readers will be familiar with Inuit family practices of putting old people out on the ice and letting them painlessly freeze to death. And he gives some other examples like that, where people in tribes are forced to do something we wouldn't consider compassionate at all, but because of the circumstances that they're in. So there are limits to the amount of compassion that even a group is willing to spend. All right, so let me get to the conclusion. So I've been trying to focus in this sermon on the whole topic of descriptive ethics, how people actually act instead of how they should act. So I'm focused on trying to understand how morality actually works in the wild, how people interact with, how, this interchange of compassion. Compassion is a complex emotion. I believe it has its roots in biology, but of course it can also be molded by your social group. You feel compassion for someone when the person experiences bad luck. What counts as sufficiently bad and what counts as luck is dependent on your social group. You are more likely to blame someone who smokes and dies of lung cancer today than 100 years ago. As we have seen, there's an economy of compassion. If someone has shown compassion for you in the past, then you have taken on an obligation to be compassionate to that person in the future. You can build a compassion debt that must be paid. After our unconscious self has learned the right rules, compassion springs effortlessly to our conscious self in the right situations, and we use these unconscious compassion rules to be nicer people. Fundamentally, compassion is acknowledgement that bad things can happen to good people. Let's discuss.